Hi, I'm Tarisa Little. I use she, her pronouns. I am a postdoctoral associate in the History Department and the Native American Indigenous Studies Initiative. I am currently working on a chapter titled The Students of Aataentsic, the Wyandot of Anderdon Day School. This chapter is part of a forthcoming monograph, and this project really began in 2017 when I was beginning my PhD under Dr. Catherine LaBelle. She is a Wyandotte Studies scholar and an adopted member of the Wyandotte in Quebec City area. Members of the Wyandot of Anderdon Nation actually reached out to Dr. LaBelle. The Wyandot of Anderdon Nation is another community within the larger diasporic community of Wyandotte. The Wyandot of Anderdon Nation passed a pamphlet on to Dr. LaBelle, knowing that I was a ethnohistorian, community engaged scholar who researches Indigenous education. In this pamphlet was a sentence that stated there was a, quote, Indian burying ground school, end quote, that was across the street from the Wyandotte Cemetery, hence the colloquial known name. I reached out to the Wyandotte members who had left contact information just in case I had any questions. I wanted to know if there was any oral history within the community about this school. However, most of the Wyandotte community members that I spoke with had only heard of the school in the context that their ancestors had attended. So I decided to investigate this school for my PhD project. So I decided to come up with a list of research questions for my investigation, beginning with who constructed the school on the Anderdon Reserve, who was running the school, who was attending the school, and who was hiring the teachers, and specifically what were the teachers teaching. In the summer of 2018, I was also lent a private archive that was under the purview of the Worrell family historian. Within this archive were newspaper articles, photos, and personal biographies of community members. What is most interesting is the community members that were listed in the biographies had actually attended this Anderdon Day School. The newspaper clippings that were included were also from a newspaper archive I had previously researched and found that there were a few issues missing, which in my case meant that I couldn't find the information about Anderdon Day School in this public archive. However, the newspaper clippings that were in the private archive that the community had lent me had more information about this Anderdon Day School. Through the newspaper clippings from the private archive, I was able to understand that the Wyandot of Anderdon actually had established the school themselves. They constructed it. They used their own money to build the school, to hire teachers, and they were able to teach whatever type of curriculum they wanted because during this time, the school was labeled as a private school. Within the private archive, there were also photos, one of which was a photo of the physical building, which was modeled after a traditional log cabin rather than using stone, which is interesting because the Wyandotte had a stone quarry that they ran on the reserve. The biographical write-ups of community members in the private archive were also really important because they discussed Wyandotte ways of knowing, and I learned that many members who attended this school also spoke 3 languages, French, English, and Wyandotte. So from this information, I was able to infer that either the Wyandotte were learning these 3 languages in school, or at the least the inclusion of Western-style education did not impair Wyandotte tradition, as both settler and Indigenous knowledge systems were occurring simultaneously. As I stated earlier, this research is part of a broader project, a forthcoming monograph. In my research, I highlight that there was a long-established pattern of mixing settler and Indigenous ways of knowing, at least for the Wyandotte during this time. The Wyandotte developed a cultural matrix where both Wyandotte and non-Wyandotte practices were existing together. However, without the knowledge gifted to me by community members through oral and material sources, the history of Wyandotte engagement with colonial schools would be relatively unknown and incomplete. Because of the guidance and support of the Wyandot of Anderdon Nation, this project provides a unique look into Indigenous education. Specifically, my research reveals that within the broader history of Indian schooling, there was at least one instance of cooperative education that was occurring within an Indigenous community at the same time that the broader residential school system was being established across Canada.